In this video, we get to look at Eloquent Relationships, which actually is pretty fun. So let me demonstrate this. If we visit the article Eloquent model, here's what we have so far. Our fillable fields, any dates that should be treated as carbon instances. We have a query scope here, and then we have a mutator. So now let's think about it. When you have an article, well, that's created by a user. So a user can create many articles. And by that same definition, we could say that a single article belongs to a user, or a single article was written or created by one user. This is something that could be true for our application, right? Okay, so that means a user can write many articles, or in the context of Laravel, a user has many articles, and an article belongs to a user. That is a relationship there. And there's lots of different ones that we could define if you think about it. For example, an article could have many tags applied to it. However, on the flip side, a tag does not specifically belong to an article. A tag itself could have many articles as well. So we have all of these different kinds of relationships. Here's another one. A user, or a member of your site, could have one address or one phone number. So that's a little different. Before, a user could write many articles. However, in this case, a user has exactly one phone number. And for the inverse, that phone number, once again, belongs to the user. Okay, so we have the 101 of relationships, but how do we represent that in Laravel? Well, I'm going to show you. Let's switch back to our application. Now, it's true we have the article class, but also Laravel comes with a user class straight out of the box. So if we take a look at that, still very simple. So now if I want to say a user can write many articles, or in other words, when we create an article, we need some way to associate that article with a user in our system. Well, here's how. Right down here, how do I want to represent this relationship? Or in other words, when I am writing this out, what do I want it to look like? Okay, well, I have my user, and if I want to fetch that user's articles, and only that user's articles, and nobody else's, wouldn't it be cool if I could just say user articles? Okay, well, let's try this out. We will make this a method. And now for Laravel and Eloquent, I'm going to create a relationship like so. Does a user have many articles? Yes. So return this has many, and now I give the name of the associated Eloquent class. In this case, article. So app article. And now if I add my doc blocks here really quickly, a user can have many articles. Cool. So we have one side of the equation, but what about the flip side? Well, let's go to an article. And we said that an article belongs to a user. So how would we represent that? Well, how about article and get me the user who created that article? Easy enough. So we have user, and now this relationship will be an article belongs to a user. And then once again, set up our doc block. An article is owned by a user. Now here's the important thing to understand. You can represent this terminology however you want. So notice how I said owns. Well, if you want to instead represent this with article owner, the owner of the article, then change it. Or if you want to say the article's writer, and that would give you the writer of the article and all of their information, then you can update this. You can represent this however you wish. In our case, just to be explicit and clear, I'm going to stick with the user. Just know that you have full control over this. Okay, so this is looking really good on the Laravel and Eloquent front, but we also need to think about our table structure. Within our database, we still have no connection between an article and a user. Let me show you. If we take a look at our migration again, well, we have a title, body, and timestamps, but we have no section to represent the creator of that article or the corresponding user. And we can do that through simple foreign keys. So we could add a new one here, table, integer, user ID. And that way, we have a hook to latch onto. However, I'm also going to add an additional one here, unsigned. Think of this as our way of saying the integer must be positive. So something like -4, no, that won't work. It needs to be positive. Next, while what we have here is fine, you also might want to set up a foreign constraint. For example, think of any application. Is it possible that when a user deletes their account, you also want to delete any of the various things they own? In the context of this little demo blog app, if a user deletes their account, do we also want to delete any of the articles that they have written? And the answer might be yes or no, depending upon what specifically you're building. If the answer is yes, then we can automate this process. When a user deletes their account, then also cascade down and delete any of the articles that belong to that user. Here's how we represent that. At the bottom, I'll say table, and we have a foreign key here, specifically user ID, and that's going to reference, so that references the ID field on what table? Well, on the users table. Once again, notice how with Laravel and our schema builder, you just write it out almost exactly the way you'd speak it. Our foreign key here, user ID, yeah, that references the ID field on the users table. But next, what about that idea of when a user deletes their account? Well, we could say on delete, and let's do cascade, like I said earlier. So when the user deletes their account, cascade down and delete any of their articles and any other appropriate records. Okay, so this looks good. And remember, because we haven't pushed anything up to production and we don't have a production database, in those scenarios, it's perfectly okay to update your original migration. Just roll everything back and rerun it. However, if you already have something on the production end, you can't really do that because you can't get rid of that existing data. So in those situations, you would create a new migration to add the user ID and the foreign restraint. Okay, so we've updated our migration. Let's reset everything. So if we run PHP Artisan again, you'll see we have some various migrate commands here. This is the one that we want. We will begin by rolling back all database migrations, and then we will rerun them. Okay? So PHP Artisan, migrate, refresh. Now, of course, just remember when we run this, any data you had locally, well, that would be reset as well. So any rows in our articles table will, of course, be deleted. That's expected behavior. Okay, so we rolled our migrations back and we reran them. Good deal. So now to demonstrate this, we need some kind of user. And Laravel actually gives us some nice authentication and registration out of the box. But I want to dedicate a full video to that. So in this lesson, let's quickly spike out a user. We will use PHP Artisan Tinker to do that. User equals new app user. And if I switch back to our editor, here is our migration for the users table. We need to give it a username, an email, and a password. User, the username will be John Doe. And the user's email address will be john@example.com. And finally, the user's password will be password. However, we always want to hash our passwords. And this is basic database security. When a user gives you their password, you never, ever, ever, ever want to store it in clear text. You always want to hash it. So of course, Laravel provides some nice facilities to do this, like this, hash make. Or alternatively, in Laravel 5, we have a little helper function called bcrypt, and this will do literally the exact same thing. It's just a wrapper around hash make. Okay, so let's run that. And notice it generates this long hash for us. This is fine for entering into the table. And then finally, that should be good, so let's save it. And we have our user. So if we get the first user from the database, and we cast that to an array, we should get that one, and we do. Okay, good. So we have a dummy user here. How would we now create an article and associate it with that user? Well, let me show you. And we will be brief here. So from our articles controller, right up here, this is where we would store a new article. So practically speaking, in real life, you would have an authentication system. So then you would just say, set the user ID equal to the authenticated user. And you could represent that like so. This refers to the person who is currently signed in. However, like I said, we haven't yet set this up. In fact, we're going to do it in the very next lesson. So for now, we're going to fake it with the understanding that we'll fix it or adjust it, really, in the next lesson. Okay, so let's visit our form for an article, and temporarily, and I'll say temporary, we're going to add a hidden input that has the ID of the user that we want to associate this with. We can do that by saying form hidden. We want a hidden input for the user ID, and we'll set that to 1 because we only have one user. So the ID of 1 is what we want here. And that should do it at least for our first pass. But always think about potential security issues. Is it possible that when a person fills out this form, they could open Chrome development tools and they could change this from 1 to 2? Well, then when they submit the form, they are creating an article that will be associated with an entirely different person. These are the sorts of things that you need to think about, which is why I'm specifically making this temporary. We don't really want this in a real application. But until we set up our membership system, this will do. Okay, so why don't we switch over to article, and we will make this mass assignable. Once again, temporary. And let's try this out in the browser. So if we visit Chrome, let's do a new article here, the body, publish on today. And if we add that, everything looks good. And if we now fetch that app article, once again, just grab the very first one and cast that to an array, notice that we have in fact set the user ID to John Doe. So now we can check out our relationships. And to do that, we can stay within Tinker for the time being. So let's grab our first user, app user first. Okay, so we have John Doe. Now I want to say, give me all articles that John Doe has created. User, articles, and once again, cast that to an array to make it easy to consume. And there you go. As easy as that, we call user articles, and we receive a collection of all articles that have a user ID of 1. Now, I want to be sure that I drill this in. So if we go back to user, this is available because of this method here. And if you're wondering, well, this is a method, so why didn't we say user articles? And this is a little confusing, I admit. If we run that though, you'll see that what you get in return is a has many object. And this allows us to continue chaining. For example, the easiest way for me to demonstrate this is just to show you both results. So when we did user articles, well, that returned to us a collection. But when we do user articles as a method, well, to get the same result, you would have to then call get. Very similar to what we did within our controller. Same idea. So if we do that, this would be equivalent. Okay? But when you use it as a method, if you need to add some additional constraints, then you can do that. User articles where the title is equal to new article. Of course, this is just going to return the exact same record, but for a big result set, of course that wouldn't. Then get that. Because we call it as a method, now we get a collection. And once again, we can cast it to an array to review. But when we do user articles, well, of course you can't do that because now when we run this, we're getting a collection. And we haven't really talked about collections just yet. I'll make a note to dedicate a full video to that since they're really cool. A collection is like an array on steroids. It's how you wish you could interact with a set of items. But we will table that for now. So just remember, when you reference a relationship, but you don't actually call it as a method, behind the scenes, Laravel's still sort of listening for it, or Eloquent is listening for it. And it will detect, oh, I see what you're trying to do here. You want a collection for the relationship. Okay? So now, if I go back to article, let's review the inverse. Let's say instead of having a user, we actually have an article. And I instead want to say, give me the user or the owner of this article. Let's try that. Okay, this time, let's fetch some kind of article. We'll just grab the first one. Good. And now I can say article user, and we will cast that to an array. It works in both ways. And the key thing to understand is the method you reference here will dictate what kind of SQL query will ultimately be generated. When we say an article belongs to a user, well, what we are really saying is that the articles table needs to have some kind of user ID column, and that will be our hook, because we have a belongs to relationship. So to finish up this video, I want you to think about some of the conveniences you'd have here. If you ever wanted to view all articles for a user, then you might have a URI like users John Doe /articles. You would listen for that, and then all you would have to do behind the scenes is something as simple as get the user, so app user, where the username is equal to what was entered there, and we'll grab the first result. Okay, so we have our John Doe user. Next, we want to get all articles for the user, as represented right here. Okay, articles equals user articles, and now we have them. Finally, within your controller, you have your collection, so just pass that to a view. And that would be something like return view articles.index, and then you would pass through the list of articles for the user. So once again, very clean and very simple.